War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 89, the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a short but strategically transformative conflict that completely altered the balance of power in the Atlantic and Pacific. Though it only lasted from April to August of 1898, the war decisively ended Spain's role as any kind of imperial power and marked the emergence of the United States as an overseas empire with global strategic interests. This conflict did not arrive suddenly, and nor were its outcomes limited to battlefield results alone. The war reflected longer-term economic, political, ideological, and certainly military trends that converged at the close of the 19th century. By the 1890s, Spain's once vast empire had been reduced to a small collection of overseas territories, notably Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. Of these, Cuba was the most economically valuable and politically unstable. Cuban resistance to Spanish rule had persisted intermittently since the 10-Year War from 1868 to 1878, and a renewed Cuban War of Independence erupted yet again in 1895. Spanish authorities struggled to suppress the rebellion, relying on large garrisons and coercive counterinsurgency policies. The most controversial of these policies was the, stop me if you've heard this before, reconcentration program implemented by Governor General Valeriano Weyler, which forcibly relocated rural populations into controlled zones. And this policy resulted in widespread hunger, disease, and overall suffering. Reports of the conditions circulated widely in the United States, where newspapers often exaggerated events, but nonetheless shaped public opinion. American humanitarian concerns, of course, combined with the significant U.S. economic investments in Cuba, particularly in sugar production, to generate pressure for intervention. Strategic and ideological factors also played an important role. The United States was undergoing rapid industrialization and increasingly sought overseas markets and secure maritime routes. Of course, naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan, my guy, argued that national greatness depended on sea power, which itself required overseas bases. His ideas unquestionably influenced policymakers who viewed Spanish colonial possessions as both strategically vulnerable and geopolitically useful. The destruction of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor on 15 February 1898 intensified tensions. Although the cause of the explosion was never conclusively determined, it unquestionably hardened American public sentiment and accelerated the march towards war. When war became imminent, American leaders articulated relatively limited but strategically, call it coherent, objectives. In the Caribbean, the United States sought to expel Spain from Cuba, eliminate Spanish naval power, and secure the approaches to the Gulf of Mexico, now known as the Gulf of America. In the Pacific, the goal was to destroy Spain's Asiatic squadron and neutralize Spanish control of the Philippines, thereby extending American influence into East Asia. Spain's strategic position was far weaker. Its navy suffered from technological inferiority, inadequate training, and logistical shortcomings. Spanish fleets were divided between home waters and overseas stations, limiting their ability to concentrate force. Going back to Mahan. Spanish colonial armies were big on paper, but had very few supplies, vulnerable to the diseases they were not used to, and dependent upon maritime lines of communication that, due to the state of their fleet, could be easily disrupted. American planning emphasized naval supremacy as the decisive element of the war, and rightly so. Control of the sea would allow the United States to blockade Spanish ports, isolate overseas garrisons, transport troops, and force decisive engagements against Spanish fleets. This approach reflected both strategic necessity and the growing professionalism of the U.S. Navy during the late 19th century. The opening engagement of the war occurred in the Pacific theater. Commodore George Dewey, commanding the U.S. Asiatic Squadron, received orders to seek out and destroy Spanish naval forces in the Philippines. Man, what a cool order. On 1 May 1898, Dewey led his squadron into Manila Bay and engaged the Spanish fleet under Rear Admiral Patricio Montojo. The Battle of Manila Bay was decisive in its demonstration of modern naval warfare. Dewey's ships, constructed of steel and equipped with rapid-fire artillery, maintained formation and delivered sustained, accurate fire. The Spanish fleet, comprised largely of older and lightly armored vessels, had nothing. Within hours, the Spanish squadron was destroyed or completely inoperable, while American losses were negligible. The strategic consequences of Manila Bay were profound. Spain's naval power in the Pacific ceased to exist, and the United States gained effective control of the Philippines' principal maritime approaches. The battle also underscored the importance of training, industrial capacity, and command efficiency. While the victory did not immediately secure complete control of the archipelago, it ensured that subsequent operations would proceed under conditions of complete American naval dominance. In the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy implemented a blockade of Cuba, designed to isolate Spanish forces and compel a fleet engagement. Spanish naval strategy, constrained by inferior forces and political considerations, sought to avoid this decisive battle while maintaining a symbolic presence. Admiral Pascual Cervera's Caribbean squadron sailed from Cape Verde Islands in an attempt to reach the West Indies and disrupt American operations. After a difficult transatlantic voyage, Cervera's squadron entered Santiago de Cuba in June of 1898. American naval forces quickly identified the squadron's location and established a tight blockade of the harbor. This blockade effectively trapped the Spanish fleet and allowed American planners to coordinate naval and land operations against Santiago with no hindrance from the Spanish. The blockade highlighted the importance of intelligence, communications, and logistical endurance. American ships maintained constant pressure on the harbor while preparing to engage the Spanish fleet should it attempt to escape. The strategic situation increasingly favored the United States as Spanish options quickly disappeared. The principal American ground effort of the war took place in eastern Cuba, with the objective of capturing Santiago de Cuba and destroying Cervera's fleet. U.S. Army forces landed at Daiquiri and Siboney in June of 1898. These forces included regular Army units, state volunteers, and cavalry formations operating largely as dismounted infantry. The campaign exposed significant challenges in American military organization. Troops contended with rugged terrain, limited transportation, infrastructure, and inadequate supply systems. Tropical disease, and particularly malaria and yellow fever, posed an even greater threat than Spanish fire. Despite these obstacles, American forces advanced towards Santiago, engaging Spanish defenders in a series of actions. At Las Guasimas on 24 June, American units encountered Spanish rearguard positions and succeeded in pushing them back, though coordination and reconnaissance proved not so good. More intense fighting occurred on 1 July at El Caney and San Juan Heights. At El Caney, Spanish troops under General Joaquin Vara del Rey conducted a stubborn defense from fortified positions, delaying the American advance for much of the day. Although eventually overwhelmed, the defense again demonstrated the effectiveness of prepared field fortifications against superior forces. At San Juan Heights, American forces assaulted elevated Spanish positions dominating the approaches to Santiago. After heavy fighting and significant casualties, American troops secured the heights, gaining a decisive tactical advantage. The capture of this terrain placed Santiago under direct threat and further constrained Spanish options. This is, of course, the famous Battle of San Juan Hill, where Teddy Roosevelt, a future president, made his name. The naval battle of Santiago de Cuba was the decisive naval engagement of the Caribbean theater, and it occurred on 3 July of 1898. Under pressure from Spanish authorities, Admiral Cervera attempted to break out of Santiago Harbor with his remaining ships. American naval forces, commanded by Admiral William T. Sampson and Commodore Winfield Scott Schley, were prepared to intercept the sortie. The Battle of Santiago de Cuba unfolded as a running engagement along the coast. American ships possessed superior speed, armor, and firepower, enabling them to pursue and systematically destroy the Spanish vehicles. By the end of the battle, all Spanish ships had been sunk or driven ashore, and Spain's Caribbean squadron, much like its Asiatic sister, ceased to exist. The victory confirmed American command of the sea and removed any remaining naval threat to U.S. operations in the Caribbean. It also illustrated the decisive relationship between naval power and strategic outcome, as the destruction of the fleet directly precipitated the collapse of Spanish resistance at Santiago. Following the destruction of the Spanish fleet, Spanish authorities recognized that continued resistance was untenable. Santiago formally surrendered on 17 July 1898. Although limited skirmishing occurred elsewhere, major combat operations in Cuba effectively ended with the city's fall. The Cuban campaign revealed important lessons for the United States. Naval coordination and operational planning proved effective, while Army logistics, medical preparedness, and command integration showed clear deficiencies. Disease caused far more casualties in combat, yet again underscoring the need for reform in military sanitation and expeditionary planning. These things would be addressed later on, notably in the development of the Panama Canal, which utilized many lessons learned, and also in the Dick Act, which reformed the National Guard into a more federalized force. American operations in Puerto Rico began in late 1898 under the command of General Nelson A. Miles. U.S. forces landed on the island's southern coast and advanced inland with very little resistance. Spanish forces were dispersed and lacked the resources to mount any sort of defense. Although combat was limited, the Puerto Rican campaign carried significance. Control of the island strengthened American dominance in the Caribbean and provided a secure base along key maritime routes. Hostilities ended before any large-scale engagements could occur, but the operation continued to the broader strategic objectives of the war. After the naval victory at Manila Bay, American forces faced the task of securing Spanish positions ashore. Spanish troops retained control of Manila, while Filipino insurgents under Emilio Aguinaldo resumed their campaign against Spanish rule. American commanders cooperated tactically with Filipino forces while maintaining independent strategic objectives. U.S. ground forces arrived during the summer of 1898, and Manila was encircled by American and Filipino units. On 13 August 1898, American and Spanish forces engaged in a brief battle for the city. The engagement occurred after a ceasefire had been agreed upon in principle, though news had not yet reached the commanders involved. The capture of Manila transferred control of the Philippines capital to the United States and ended Spanish military authority in the archipelago. However, unresolved political questions regarding sovereignty and self-determination would soon lead to renewed conflict. An armistice formally ended hostilities on 12 August 1898. The Treaty of Paris, signed on 10 December of 1898, established the formal terms of peace. Spain recognized Cuban independence and ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The treaty marked a turning point in American foreign policy. By acquiring overseas territories, the United States assumed new strategic responsibilities and entered debates over imperialism, governance, and constitutional authority. The acquisition of the Philippines was particularly controversial and had long-term military and political consequences. The strategic end state of the Spanish-American War was defined by American naval supremacy, territorial expansion, and increased global influence. In the Caribbean, the United States emerged as the dominant power, completely securing it as an American-controlled lake. The acquisition of the Philippines and Guam extended American reach into East Asia and reinforced the importance of maritime power and went far beyond the normal Monroe Doctrine. America was no longer worried about just the Western Hemisphere. Militarily, the war validated Mahanian principles of sea power and highlighted the importance of modern fleets. At the same time, deficiencies in Army organization and medical support prompted significant reforms. The conflict served as a bridge between 19th century continental defense and 20th century global strategy. The Spanish-American War, although it didn't go on for very long, has an enduring impact today. Through decisive naval battles and coordinated land campaigns, the United States achieved its strategic objectives and reshaped the international system in but months, and put a final nail in the coffin of the Spanish Empire that had lasted for hundreds of years.
Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.